My name is Wyllie. I was born in Romania, Bucharest, Romania, which is the capital of Romania. And my father was an American citizen when I was born, and that automatically made me an American citizen, which saved our lives. My brother was on my passport. Did you see the passport?
Okay, let's start over because I
Oh,
don't
I'm
want
sorry.
you saying, did you see my password?
Oh,
Because
okay.
what I'm going to do is, this is going to be like you're talking to the kids.
Oh, okay.
We're going to match it in. That's perfect, though. You're saying it just how I want it.
Okay.
Okay?
Mhm.
Yeah, I love that. I also want to know how old you were when the war started. We'll get to that, so.
Okay.
All right, so start again with, my name is Wyllie.
Okay.
Okay.
Whenever you're ready.
Okay. My name is Wyllie. I was born in Romania, Bucharest, Romania, which is the capital of the city. When I was born, my father was an American citizen, which automatically made me an American citizen. And I lived on the passport my entire life in Romania. This is the thing that saved my life. The fact that I was an American citizen, and when the Allied citizens left Romania, like the American consul left Romania, we were under the protection of the Swiss legation. And I was there. My father left Romania when I was 5 years old. And then after my father left, my aunt invited me to go to live at her house, and she lived in the Carpathian Mountains, which was beautiful, absolutely. The Carpathian Mountains is part of the Alps and the Carpathians. And I lived in the area that's called Transylvania, which is where Dracula was. I was there for about 6 months, and then I came back to Bucharest, and then things started to happen.
What year was that?
I must have been 1996, so must have been 1937. And that's when the Nazi Party, which was the black shirts of Romania, invited Germans to come in as allies, as advisors. And they came and they advised, they kind of took over. And that's when they started to make rules.
How old were you?
I was 7. Before that, Bucharest is called the Petit Paris, and which means a small Paris. And we had theaters, and we had movies, and we had concerts. And my mother and I and my brother, we used to go to all kinds of places. I had 2 uncles. One was the director of stage design, and the other one was the director of lighting in 2 different theaters. So I went to the theater quite often. And I remember Mama always made me take a nap so I can be awake at nighttime, and she would pinch my cheeks to make it red. Anyway, so we had a great time. I went to grade school. Because the Jews were not allowed to go to regular Romanian schools, we had to go to Jewish schools. But my mother had decided that I was going to go to private school, the same private school that she went to, so that I really didn't have a problem. My brother had to be enrolled into a Jewish school for boys.
Younger or older than you?
He's younger. He was 3.5 years younger than I was. And anyway, so my school was a very old, established school for young ladies. And we had a very large building with a very large front yard. And one day, the principal came to our class and said, "Take everything that belongs to you." And she said, "Walk out." And then when we walked out, there were the German soldiers like making a gauntlet, I think it's called, and we had to walk through and we had to go home. And that was the last time I ever went to that building because they just took it over. And during that time, the war started. It was 1938, I think. That's when the first the Russians started to bomb. And that wasn't a big deal. They didn't do such a good job, so that it was not as bad as when the Americans and the English started to bomb. That was a different story. They used to come twice a day. Once at about 10:30 in the morning, and then the second time was at nighttime at about 1 o'clock. It seems, I learned this later, that they had a base in Italy, and it would take them X amount of time to get from Italy to Romania. And Romania is a very rich country as far as natural, what would you call it? Resources, yeah. And among other things, there was also an oil refinery in a city called Ploiești. So the Americans, most of the times, came twice a day. And when the weather was bad and they couldn't get to Ploiești, they would dump their bombs on Bucharest, because that was the capital of the city, and there were lots and lots of things that were in Bucharest that was important, the railroads and all that stuff. So our lives, from going to the theater, as a matter of fact, the first time that the Allied bombs, we had tickets to see Morning Becomes Electra. So my mother was worried that we were going to go ahead and miss curtain time. We did miss it. So anyway, but from going to the theater and going to concerts and all that stuff, it was, you had to arrange your life around the 10 o'clock visit from the Allies, and of course at nighttime you were in bed, so everything.
So how scary was that for you?
It's amazing what a child of 7 could accept. It was, I guess that's when I became a fatalist. If it happens, it happens. And we tried, I guess that's when I created, or I developed a sense of humor. Because if you didn't laugh, you cried.
Did your mother laugh or cry? How did she handle it?
My poor mama, she was very stoic about the whole thing, because she couldn't show the fact that she was nervous or that she was afraid, because then we would have gone to pieces. So she was the one that was always, it's okay, it's over, it'll be over soon, so that she was my rock. But it's, as I said before, it's amazing what a 7-year-old will accept. You don't know anything else. You think that this is the normal way of doing things, and the fact that we were hungry, and Mama used to go ahead and say, well, this morning I'm not hungry, you can have my allowance of bread. And of course, the two of us were young and hungry, and we didn't realize what she was doing until later on. And I remember one time when she and I were walking on the street, and she said, I'm going across the street. She said, if I come out with some soldiers, you go to Tanti Tony, that's your Aunt Tony, and tell her that Mama went with some soldiers. She risked her life for a pound of butter, because at that time, we didn't have butter, or so she thought that there's anything to keep me fat. And she used to take me to a bar every day and make me drink a glass of beer, because she heard that this was healthy. And I didn't like to drink the beer. Of course, I didn't have pizza, but anyway. So that life, we kept on living, surrounding all those things, trying to cope with the bombs, trying to cope with with the earthquakes, because the thing, I haven't made up my mind which one is better, the earthquake or the bombings. At least in the bombings, if you go into a shelter in the ground, you either get killed or you can come out. But when there's an earthquake, you don't know where to go because you don't know where the earth is going to split. So as I said before, I haven't made up my mind which one is better. There's no better on those two things. But anyway.
And so your father leaving, that was just because did that have anything to do with the war coming on? With the
Yes.
crisis? Tell me about
He
that.
decided that, I was 5 years old, and he decided that things were not so very good in Romania and that we should come to America. And since he was an American citizen, this was easy for him, and we were supposed to follow him. The only thing is when we started it was decided, I don't remember what decided my mother that we should follow, or I think my father sent the money so we could leave. By that time, Paris was occupied, so we couldn't go anyplace. So we were in Romania for 10 years, and we didn't hear from him, and he decided that we were dead. So he didn't know whether we were alive or, and he loved airplanes, so we were under the impression that he was probably in the Air Force at that time. I don't know, it wasn't there. Anyway, so we lived with a Nazi until I was 12 years old, so that was 1931, 1943. And then the Russians came. And the Russians, they tried to teach us democracy by lifting the watches and the coats, winter coats that they liked, without asking what your name was. During the Nazis, the time that the Nazis were there were some very nice people who saved our lives. There was my landlord. We lived in an apartment house, 2-story building, and in front there was a grocery store, and then in the back were the apartments, and you had to put a sign on your business window that this was a grocery that was owned by a Christian. And he refused to do that, the owner of the store. So one night the soldiers came. They were always busy at nighttime. And they started to bang around to find out how come this store doesn't have a sign to say that it was owned by a Christian. And the landlord came down, and he said, of course it is owned by a Christian. He said, I wouldn't even think of renting to Jews. So the Goldbergs were living there, and the Rosenbergs were living there, and the Epsteins were living there. So that if they really would have tried to find out, he would have been in a lot of trouble.
How did you happen to be living there?
My parents found that apartment before my father left. So
So he just protected you.
right. And then there was another neighbor on the other side, and she used to call my brother and I and used to give us cookies, even though Hitler was watching us from the wall. And then when the Russians came, in the same frame, the same spot on the wall, was a picture of Stalin, and she continued to give us cookies. This woman, it's interesting the things that you bring with you when there's bombing. This woman always used to bring her radio in the shelter, which was a hole dug in the earth, or if we could fit into a basement. She always carried her little radio, and now I realized that it was so silly because she couldn't plug it any place. But I guess you took your most important thing, and to her was the radio. And then the men, forgive me, dear. But they used to go out to look, the bombs were falling, and they used to admire the planes, and my brother was right in there with them. He always loved planes. As a matter of fact, He died in a plane crash. He had his own plane, and something happened with the winds in the Sierras in Mexico, and he crashed his plane. But as I said before, we tried to keep as normal life as possible.
Were you protective of your brother, being that you were older?
Yeah, I guess so. Although we used to fight a lot. I have a little scar someplace to prove that. Yeah. I am older, but he was bigger. It's interesting that we both discovered at the same time that we were not so bad after all, and we became very good friends. And we had such a rapport that we would look at one another and we could answer without asking the question. We knew what we were talking about.
What did you think was going to happen with the, you've got you're in your home, the bombings are happening. What did you see was going to happen to your family?
Well, I knew we were living on a passport, on my passport. I knew that.
What do you mean when you say you were living on your passport?
Okay.
How do you mean that?
That this is the thing that was going to save us, the passport.
What if you didn't have that passport?
Our chances were not so very good because they came after us one night. And the only reason why they didn't come back was because the Swiss legation called them up and said these people are protected by the Swiss legation. So again, it was that passport that gave us the chance, because otherwise I would have ended up in a concentration camp. They didn't come at nighttime just to check the papers the way they said they did, because they would come at nighttime and then all of a sudden a whole family would be missing the next morning. So that it was, all I knew is that eventually I was going to come to America. And that's the way we lived. I guess it was hope. And it was just take one day at a time, like the alcoholics say. Take one day at a time and live through that day, and then tomorrow you'll see what's going to happen.
Okay, take a drink.
Thank you.
Now, this is good. This is just what I want. This is exactly what I want. You were telling me about the night that you had. Tell me about the maid and the knock on the door.
One night, it was about 11:30 at nighttime, and there was a knock on the door, and the maid opened the door. She really was a very brave girl. She was only about 19 years old. But anyway, the maid opened the door, and the soldiers were there. And they asked for the Goldbergs. And Mama was in the back of the door, and Mama shook her head. And Paulina, the maid, said, they're not home. And then we ran out. Mama made a sign that don't say anything. She grabbed our coats, and we ran out through the window on the other side of the building. And we took a trolley, and we went to my aunt's house. And then the next morning, Mama went to the legation, Swiss legation, and told them that they came for us that night. And then the Swiss contacted them and told them, don't touch them, they're Americans. So it was something that at that time, to be an American, it was a very, how should I say, a wonderful, marvelous thing. People respected the American people. And I'm sorry to see what's happening in the world now.
Now, your mother was Romanian, so...
She wasn't.
What was she?
Because...
Say my mother.
Okay. My mother, she was born in Romania. She lived in Romania all her life. The only thing is, one of the laws that the Germans made was that the Jews did not have Romanian citizenship. So she didn't have a citizenship. She was just a woman without a country. And she lived in Romania, and then when we came here, she came here as taking care of two minor American citizens. So, because she couldn't become, even though she was married to an American citizen, but you cannot become an American citizen until you live here for 5 years. And she had never been to America until 1946 when we came here.
So she was protected, though, by the Swiss legation?
Yeah.
Because of you?
Because of my brother and I.
So tell me that. So my mother was protected.
Right. My mother was protected because she was in charge of 2 American citizens. And that's how she came to the United States.
Okay. Wonderful. Let's see. Tell me, you had talked about the school you went to and the day that you decided not to go to school. Tell me about that.
Oh, well, they had taken our school away, so classes were being held in different temples. And one day, I walked to school and I stood across the street from the temple that was my class, and I somehow or another I just didn't feel like going in. And I stood there for a very long time, and then I decided I'm going back home. And when I went home, my mother was very angry. No matter what, you have to study. So she was very angry, and she was really very mad. And then a neighbor came in and said, "Did you hear what's happening?" And while I was outside making up my mind to go back home, the soldiers were beating my teacher in front of the children that were already in the classroom. And ever since then, I never argue with my Romanian bones. I somehow or other have a feeling, and I say, I'm not doing it, so I don't do it.
So, as a young child, you learned a lot of lessons. You tell me also about the story when you went to your aunt's house alone.
Okay. I was 10 years old, and Mama put me in the trolley, and I went to my aunt's house. And I was very excited because I was mature enough to go on the trolley by myself. It was quite a distance. And when I arrived at my aunt's house, she gave me something to drink, and she said, "Okay, come on, let's go back." And she took a package with her, and she went ahead and she told the conductor to tell me at such and such a station to get off, and she put the package underneath my seat. And when the conductor told me that this was the stop, I picked up the package and got off the train, and Mama was waiting for me. What I didn't know is that I was carrying contraband. I was carrying flour. And that day we had extra bread because Mama made bread. So, and another time, my uncle and I were walking on the street, and my uncle was carrying a large bag with sugar at the bottom, a bag of sugar at the bottom, and dirty socks and nasty handkerchiefs on top. And we were stopped by the police and soldiers. They were always together. And we were asked what was in there, and my uncle said, "I'm bringing my dirty laundry to my sister so she can wash it." And they wouldn't touch that bag, so they said, "Well, let's see the bottom." So he managed to move it around so that they saw the bottom of the bag, but they never saw the bag with sugar at the bottom. That was one of the times when I was talking about afraid, because we would have not had a chance if they would have known that we were carrying sugar.
So how did, when the soldiers stopped you, you know you were Jewish. Did they know you were Jewish?
No, they didn't bother to ask us because they were just trying to find out what we were carrying in the bag. So they didn't ask. I never thought of it before.
So
isn't that great?
Yeah.
They were just busy with the bag.
Trying to enforce their laws that they had put upon, but the laws were just upon the Jews. They weren't upon everyone.
Well, the thing is, even the Romanians were hungry because we didn't have, the Germans took away all the resources, the grains and the meat and everything. So We were vegetarian. We were so very avant-garde. We were vegetarians before people knew about vegetarian. I mean, we were vegetarians in the 30s and 40s, you know, because.
So it was all the Romanian people in
Yeah.
Bucharest that suffered. Tell me
Yes,
that.
yeah. Well, we didn't have, the Germans took the meat first of all, and they took the grains, and they took the sugar, and they took the butter for the troops. So we were left with vegetables, and the peasants would come to Bucharest, and we would buy vegetables. And also we had, again, avant-garde. Nowadays, to have polenta is very nice and up-to-date, or current, but I've had, Mama used to make, in Romania it's called mamaliga. She would make it in the evening, and we would have it with vegetables. And then in the morning, by that time in the morning, it kind of like ossified. And she would cut slices of it, and she would try to fry it if we had something to fry with. And then that was our breakfast. And then for lunch, she would serve it with what is in Greece called feta, and in Romania is called cheese. I mean feta. Wait. Feta in Greek and brânză in Romanian. So we eat that. And I haven't had polenta in 60 years. The same thing with beans. It took me a very long time to taste baked beans, which everybody takes. It's a good thing. Or to have, I still don't know how to make chili because it has beans in it. And it's amazing the things, how you are affected by certain things. Until recently, when the nutritionist told me you have to have whole wheat, don't eat white bread and all that stuff, I constantly bought the white bread. As a matter of fact, I just bought an Italian bread recently, and I have a small piece left, and it's delicious. I'm so sick of whole wheat bread. But anyway, and many of us from the survivors group, we are still hungry. There are 3 people in my house, my daughter, my granddaughter, and I have 2 refrigerators, which is ridiculous. And finally my daughter said, for heaven's sake, stop buying. But it's always, I guess I'm still afraid that I'm not going to have enough. And 60 years later, I'm still hungry. So that's one of the side effects.
So did you feel, I know that everyone was suffering there.
Mm-hmm.
Was it the same, or was it different that you were Jewish?
Oh, well, no. I was made aware, very much made aware that I was Jewish. When I was 9 years old, I had to have my appendix out. And there was the room had 4 beds, and there was a girl there. I was 9, and this girl must have been about 15. She used to wake me up every morning with a song about the dirty Jews and the gypsies. So that I was very much aware that I was Jewish, that being Jewish was not the very best thing to be in Romania. But I don't know, we still had a pride about ourselves. I am very fortunate because my mother and her family, they gave me a sense of security so that I was able to accept what was happening and yet still have some sort of dignity about who I was, even though they were telling me that I was a dirty Jew at 9 years old.
Tell me about when it changed over then from the Russians to the Allies.
No, it changed from the Germans to the Russians.
I mean, from the Germans to
Yeah.
the Russians.
The Russians, that night,
When was that? Around what time period?
I was 12 years old, so that was 1943. And the church bells were ringing, and everybody was shouting. They were all happy, and Mama started to cry. And I said, why are you crying? And she said, we know what we had, we don't know what we're getting. So the Russians decided they were going to teach us democracy. And they would go ahead, and if you walked on the street and if you had a watch that they liked or a winter coat, they would appropriate it. This was democracy in action. And the joke among my family was that the Russian democracy is what's mine is mine, what's yours is mine. And they continued to prove this little phrase right. Things did not improve with the Russians. There were lots of soldiers on the street, and it was still dangerous to go out at nighttime. And I have no love for the Communist Party. Their ideal was fantastic. Everybody had the same and all that stuff, but it didn't happen.
So how did you end up finally getting out of Bucharest?
Well, as I had mentioned before, I lived, every 6 months I had to have a new passport. And they would fingerprint me, and they would measure me, and they would weigh me, and they would look for scars and stuff. So that I knew that eventually we're going to go ahead, we're going to go to America. And one Friday afternoon, late afternoon, the soldier came and said, I am an American soldier, and you get ready because on Monday morning at 5 o'clock you're leaving for America. So we had the weekend to get ready to come to. This was in 1945. And
so this was after the war?
Yes. We lived, because I lived with the communists for 2 years. And the same soldiers came and took us to Constanța, which is a seaport in Romania, from Bucharest with a train to Constanța. And Mama exchanged some money with him. Mama gave him the remaining money, and he gave her $35. So, and we were on the ship for about a month. We left Christmas Eve. We spent New Year's Eve in Russia, Novorossiysk. And I thought that the Romanian bread was bad, but the Russian bread was even worse. It had pieces of stuff in it that was hard. I don't know. Anyway, and it smelled very badly. And at that time, I was on the American ship eating American cheese and white bread. Wonder bread. So anyway, and then we stopped in Istanbul on the Mediterranean. We came through the Black Sea, the Dardanelles, Bosphor, and then Istanbul. And then we passed the Gibraltar, and then we went into the Atlantic, where I was sunning myself on the Mediterranean, and it was freezing in the Atlantic. And then on the Atlantic, there were 3 mines that kind of like passed our ship, and everything stopped every time we saw a mine because we didn't know what was going to happen. And traveling, I wouldn't recommend traveling on the Atlantic in January. The waves were so bad that one time they woke us up and they said, put your life jackets on. And when I went to look out the porthole, I couldn't see the sky because the ship was listing. And my brother and I looked at one another. I guess we were hysterical because, we were laughing and laughing, and Mama, always being the lady, was trying to shush us. And I remember one of the officers on the ship spoke French to my mother and said, just leave them alone, let them laugh. And anyway, and the next morning the sea was calm and everything was fine. So we arrived in Philadelphia on January 27th, 1946. And then the struggle started. Learning how to speak the language and learning the ways of the American people. And my father, we found him, and he forbade us to speak any language but English. Now I realize what he was trying to do. At that time, we resented it because it was so much more comfortable to speak Romanian, or my mother and I used to speak French. But he would not allow us to speak anything but English. And he took me to school. I don't know what made him take me to grade school. At that time, it was up to the 8th grade, because by that time I had zoology, botany, chemistry, physics, and astronomy. And he took me to school, and the principal put a mathematical, some numbers, and he told me with a what you call decimal point, and then he told me to add them. So I went ahead and I put them with the decimal where it belonged, and I added them. Then he decided that I belonged in the 8th grade, but I didn't know how to speak English, so I had to learn how to speak English. And then I remember one time the teacher said to me, "Go show them how to use a compass." And I wasn't too sure of what she said, and then she said, "Go to hand air language." And then I showed the children how to use a compass. And then I knew the subjects. I mean, it was easy for me. And then when I was in high school and we were taking biology, and I remember the teacher gave us some homework, and I went after class. I went to her and I said, "Well, there are many ways to approach this problem. How do you do it?" And she said, "Well, you do whatever you think is right." So I went ahead and made, on my homework, I put the 4 different ways you can do this. And then the next day she walked around the class and she said, Beatrice, she called me, "Go to the board and show what you did." And of course I didn't understand, so I went to the board and I did what I did at home, and I remember her saying, "This is the only student that had the homework right." But it was easy. So that when I had to pass the Regents in New York, you have to pass the Regents. At that time, I don't know now, to graduate, and I had a 95 in Latin, and I prayed for a 65 in English.
So how old were you when you stepped off in New York City?
No, I went to Philadelphia. I never saw the Statue of Liberty. We went to Philadelphia. I was 14 in 2 months. I was 15 that November.
And how old was your brother?
My brother was 11.
And so you did meet up with your father?
Yes.
And did you then go live with him?
Yes. And that's another story.
Right. Let me ask you, why is it that you've decided to speak to the children at the Holocaust Museum?
There are lots of people that are saying it didn't happen. It happened. I saw the children coming back from the concentration camps. I saw the people coming back from concentration camps. I saw the people when they were being herded to go to concentration camps. I saw people who, if they were lucky, the men were taken to labor camps. And so that somebody should speak about it, because it did happen. I've seen it. I've seen little children, 5 and 6, when they came back from the concentration camps with their little bellies extended from hunger, so that somebody should tell them something. And you see, when I came here, everyone said, "Don't talk about it, forget about it." So you kind of push it down, and it stays there. And then finally, I was invited to join the survivors group, and then I decided I better start talking, because my granddaughter doesn't know too much about it until I start to talk about it. And my daughter, it's interesting, my daughter still, my granddaughter has seen my show tape, my daughter hasn't. And I asked her one time, when am I going to watch it? And she said, well, I want to be alone when I watch it. I still don't think she's ready to see it. A few weeks ago, I don't know whether I should say this or not.
Well, we don't have to use it.
Okay. We have a second, Felicia and I started a second and third generation. My daughter, of course, is in it, and my granddaughter belongs to it. And we were going to have a Hanukkah party. And then Felicia was out of town, and Dan, called me first, and then Jane called me later to tell me that the day we were going to have our Hanukkah party, there was going to be a picketing. And they asked me, what do you think you should do? And I thought of one of our survivors who comes from Paris, who is afraid still, 60 years later, is still afraid of uniforms. And I was told that they might be wearing uniforms. And I canceled the party. And I was very angry that the newspapers were not here, because we live in a world, in a bubble. We think everything is safe, and it's not safe. So that's why I'm talking about it.
How did you feel knowing that your neighbors, your Jewish neighbors, had been taken away, and yet you didn't? Because of your passport.
I felt, very selfishly, I felt very lucky. And the thing is, you don't know how safe you was. You didn't know whether they were going to come back, because once the Goldbergs were missing, nothing could be done about it, you know. So that it was like living on a precipice. And then, of course, at one point, some of the Jewish leaders in Romania and Bucharest contacted the Queen of Romania, King Michael's grandmother, and asked her to intervene on the Jewish behalf, and she did, so that we were kind of quasi-protected by the Queen. So that's why, if you take a look at the map of the people that died in Poland and the people that died in Romania, is very little, because the Queen of Romania had something to do with it. So.
And you talk about how hungry you were.
Mm-hmm.
How do you deal with that in terms of the fact that there were so many that were taken away, and had it so much worse than you did? Even though you were hungry. I mean, you're a child and you're hungry.
Mm-hmm.
So when they came back and you saw the extended tummies, what went through your head?
Again, how lucky I was. And I hoped that they would be helped. And they were, because they were put in camps, and they were fed and all that. But I just felt very, very fortunate.
And so when you left, when you knew you were leaving to come to America, tell me how that felt.
Well, I didn't want to come here. I want to go to Eretz Israel. I wanted to be in a kibbutz and all that stuff, because when the Russians came, a group called the Dror Habanim popped up. So I joined it. I was very pro Eretz Israel, and I wanted to go to Israel. And Mama said to me, if you don't go, Ernest and I are going to be stuck in Romania, because the passport is on your name. So we made a bargain. I will come to America, so they can come to America, and then when I'm 21, I can do whatever I want. Well, by the time I was 21, I had lots of shoes and lots of clothes, and I had a job, and I was going out, and I was having so much fun. Who wants to go to a kibbutz?
So what is the message when you talk to the children here at the museum that you want them to walk away with?
First of all, to be tolerant of people who come from other countries.
Start over there and say, I would like for the children that I talk to.
I would like for the children that I talk with to be tolerant of people that come from other places, to be tolerant between one another, not to call one another names like fat or ugly or whatever. And I want them to come away with the fact that until there's another political government in this world, this is still the best there is. And the fact that we have a privilege in voting, and that they should become involved and to know what they're doing, not just push buttons or whatever. And this is still, I think, the best country to live in.
What lessons do you think you learned from your life?
Oh, so many. I remember somebody asking me one time, what do you hope most for? And I said, the intelligence to appreciate when I have it good. And boy, do I have it good. To be, again, tolerant, to be able to accept other people, even though they are not of the same religion or belief or whatever. That people are people.
And then how do you deal with what happened to you, though? What happened to your life?
How do I deal with it? Well, lately I've been talking about it. The group, the survivors group, it's amazing. When we started the second and third generation, I talked with at the second generation, the first meeting, and I told them Felicia Graber's background. And I said, she has managed to find a home for us, a home for our old baggage. And we meet every month, once a month, and we talk about different things. And it's amazing there is an affinity. We don't have to talk much about it because each of us have had different experiences, but we all know what we're talking about. So that I think that the survivors group is very important, and also the fact that the youngest survivors member is 68 years old. And I think it's very important to have a second and third generation. There was a certain urgency that I felt when one of our survivors members died. I think we better hurry up and do something with the second and third generation. Otherwise, there will not be people, except maybe the tape, to tell them our stories. So.
Because there's loss in what you're sharing with the other survivors of what all of you lost.
Yeah. We lost our childhood. Some of us more than others. I am one of the lucky ones. My mother was still, she came here. Lots of mothers didn't. So anyway.
Do you feel that that because of your mother is how you were able to survive and handle it so well?
Oh yes.
Yeah.
My mother and her whole family was always there for my brother and I. They made us feel safe, even though when we were not safe. Even like, for instance, when the time when she was sick and I refused to go to the shelter and I stayed with her, she tried to protect me as much as possible by putting the pillow on my head so I shouldn't hear the bombs, because she didn't realize, I'm sure she was very nervous herself, that she'd push the pillow and I'd say, there's another one coming. But she always tried to make us safe. She went ahead and on, let's say, Sundays, we would both go to bed. We'd stay in bed the whole day long. It was very, very cold, and we didn't have fuel. So we would put the heater down, and we would put our coats on top of the heater down, and she would read to us. And my mother was a very sneaky way of teaching us. She read to us, instead of reading us nursery rhymes, she would read to us from the Greek mythology. So she was spoon-feeding us Greek mythology and fables, so that it was always, once you were home, it was safe. It was warm, not necessarily, but it was warm. The worst day I ever had during that time was one day when my mother was away and the alarm started. And I was scared that she wasn't going to come back. And she was afraid that when she got back to the house, she couldn't find us. I think that was the worst time I ever had during the war, because my mother was my rock. She made it safe.
How do you think that has affected you as a mother and a grandmother?
I tend to try to keep them away from bad stuff, and you cannot. I try to do a lot of stuff for them, and sometimes I think I do too much. Now I realize, on my 75th year.
So, is there any message that you have for your family, not just the kids who come, but...
Well, I am in a writing class. It's called the memory class over here. And I write things that I can remember so that I read it to them. One of the things that I wrote about was, I usually do my marketing, and I do anything, whatever I shop, I buy with my MasterCard so I can get frequent flyers, miles. And I wrote about a piece. One time I decided that I was going to go to have lunch with a friend of mine, the same friend that I had lunch today. And then I decided the last minute to go to Aldi's to pick up some wine that they had, which I liked. And I picked up a few other items, and then when I got to the store, to the cashier, I had only $16 in my wallet because I don't use money, I use my credit card. And the woman said $36. And then I said, can I leave this here? I'll go home and get the money to come back. And then when I was in the car, I said to myself, how dare you? How dare you forget that it wasn't all the times when you could buy wine and spend $36. And this is the things that I have been reading to my daughter and my granddaughter, to appreciate when they have it good.
Is that a message you want the kids today from the classes to walk away with?
Oh God, yes. Yes.
Tell me that.
Yeah. And also, they take so much for granted. My granddaughter, who has a cell phone and a TV and a computer, and she opens the refrigerator, oh, this drives me crazy, and she says there's nothing to eat in there. I try to tell them not to take anything for granted, because everything is a gift.
So when the young children walk out of here, walk out of this museum having heard your story, does that make you feel? Tell me how that makes you feel.
I hope that I reached at least one. And I hope that they weren't there just because the teacher said, you're going to go today. I hope that some of them will listen to what I have to say.
Okay, anything else you want to tell me?
I got to mention my other family. I have another family.
Okay.
I volunteered at WashU to speak with foreign exchange students and business trainees. Wonder why. And they gave me this name. His name was Yu Hong, I think that's how we pronounce it, Max Zhang. And I called him up and I said, I can't visit you. I can't meet you for the next 2 weeks because I'm going to Spain and Morocco. But when I come back, I will call you up and we'll meet. And then I said, are you here by yourself? No, first I said, what do you at WashU? He said, I'm doing research on brain ischemia, which is strokes. And I said, oh, good, keep on doing it. So I said, are you here by yourself? He said, no. He said, my wife is here with me. I said, what does she do? I said, what did you do in China? He said, I am a neurosurgeon with a PhD. And I said, what does your wife do? He said, she's just a doctor. So 2 weeks later, I came back and I called them up and we met. And we liked one another. We now love one another. And when she became pregnant, I said, because your mother is not here, I will come with you if you want me to in the in the delivery room. And I was there, and I said, I will hold your hand. I ended up holding her leg. But anyway, and that's my grandson. His name is Andy Zhang. And now, that night, my daughter went to the hospital because Emma Zhang was born. And Robin, my daughter, decided, you had Andy, I'm going to have the next one. So that's why she didn't come to the second and third generation, because she was helping with the birth of Emma Zhang.
That's wonderful.
So.
That's wonderful. It's a wonderful story.
Okay.
Well, good.